Hi, I'm Carrie Blakinger. I'm a reporter with the Marshall Project, a news organization that covers prisons and the criminal justice system. Before I was a reporter, I did a little under 2 years in prison, so today's conversation is one that means a lot to me. We're here to talk about technology and communication behind bars. Even before the pandemic, the whole world of communication in prison was fraught. Prisons are generally slow to adapt new technologies. Cell phones are illegal. And where I am in Texas, the prison system only installed landlines for prisoners to use a little over a decade ago. Between the limited availability and the high cost of calls, roughly half of prisoners say they lose touch with their friends and families while they're in prison. Now, during COVID, most prisons don't have visiting at all. So if people are going to stay in touch, technology is the only option in a lot of places. Here to talk about this with me today are my panelists, Alex Petter, Dr. Chris Beasley, and Carrie Wilkinson. I'll let them each take a minute to introduce themselves, starting with Alex.
Well, hello, my name is Alex Petter. I am the co-founder and CEO of Choreo SPC. We are a social purpose corporation. That doesn't matter what that means exactly, but we are a startup and we are in the business of providing communication technology through voicemail, text, and email services to incarcerated men and women around the country.
And Chris, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Sure. Chris Beasley. I'm assistant professor at the University of Washington, Tacoma. Certainly haven't always held the positions of privilege that I hold today. I did a little bit of time in prison back in the 2000s. And when I got out, I had an uncle that talked me into going to college. And it took me about 7 years of college before I realized that I could get a doctorate degree and become a professor. I've since dedicated my life to better understanding why I didn't imagine those possibilities for myself and why other formerly incarcerated people don't imagine those possibilities for themselves, as well as developing support programs to help expand those possibilities. And I do so through the Post-Prison Education Research Lab, where I'm principal investigator, spearheading the development of the Husky Post-Prison Pathways program at the University of Washington, Tacoma, co-founding the formerly incarcerated college graduates network, where I serve as a board director, and also serving as a board director for From Prison Cells to PhD.
Great to have you both. And Carrie, can you introduce yourself a bit?
I'm Carrie Wilkinson, and I'm the former campaign director for the Prison Phone Justice Campaign on behalf of the Human Rights Defense Center. We worked in the mid-2000s to reduce the cost of calls from prisons and jails across the country, primarily interfacing with the Federal Communications.
Well, it's great to have all of you. I want to start by talking about the current state of communications in prisons. I think a lot of people, until they go to prison or unless they go to prison, don't really realize how difficult it is to keep in touch with friends and family on the outside. When I was in prison, I remember feeling like these kinds of communications were the only sort of lifeline tethering me to reality on the outside. And Chris, you and I and Alex have all sort of experienced this firsthand. But can you speak a little bit to start us off about your experiences trying to keep in touch with your network on the outside when you were locked up?
Sure. I talked a little bit in my introduction about, an uncle talking me into going to college, right? So obviously I managed to do something eventually right in reentry. But the first year after reentry was really a struggle. I was relapsing, and it was probably just through luck and privilege that I didn't get caught and sort of didn't wind up back in prison. When I look back, I feel like a lot of that work that my uncle had done with me and other family members and the way that they supported me could have been done in prison. That time didn't have to be kind of dead time, and I felt like it was, because when I was in prison, I was mostly just hanging out with other people in prison and not really able to have solid contact with friends and family members. So I definitely see the struggles in my own life in trying to maintain contact with people. But I also see that with others who try to provide support. I mean, since I've gotten out of prison and changed my life around, I try to be a support system for others that are in prison. And I see some of those same challenges now in trying to maintain contact with them. Like I'm a busy professional now, and I'm sure many of you are busy professionals. And if you've ever tried to set up a meeting with someone, you know how important something like Doodle or Calendly is, and we just don't have those tools to set up times for people that are incarcerated in order to schedule a phone call or something like that. So asynchronous communication is really invaluable for prison systems, and yet we don't really have that kind of asynchronous communication. I also think about some of the challenges with doing scholarship. Like I try to go back into the prisons and work with people that are incarcerated, scholars that are incarcerated, and produce scholarly materials together. And yet what I found is that oftentimes I can't access people inside because I myself have been incarcerated. And there isn't any really way to maintain that communication and collaboration digitally. So really I'm not able to work on those scholarly activities together.
Thanks. I think it's really helpful to understand the personal aspect of prison communications, or, lack thereof. But Carrie, can you maybe talk some about the state of technology as it is now?
Sure. Phone calls are still the primary form of communication for those who can pay for it. There are an estimated 2.7 million children in the United States who have an incarcerated parent. So affordable calls for inmates are critical for maintaining family relationships. Being able to read a book, talk about the day, or even just to say goodnight is really important for both incarcerated parents and their children, and can go a long way for achieving some sense of normalcy for children. The prison telecom industry is a $1.2 billion industry, and in past years, revenues paid to correctional facilities for kickbacks for monopoly contracts were about 40% of revenues. The kickbacks are the primary reason that inmate telephone rates are so high. Newer technologies are starting to be introduced slowly, but unfortunately they follow the same business model. The Washington Department of Corrections does offer email services, but at a cost of 17 to 33 cents per email. Video visitation is also available, but at a cost of $7.95 for a 30-minute call. And I think we should all just take a quick second to think about our email and our video visits that we've done so many of over this last year through Skype and Zoom. How much have we paid for that? We're sure not paying these rates. Newer technologies need to continue to be implemented so families can stay in touch more easily, but we need to be really careful. One of the things that happened with video visitation is a lot of jail facilities eliminated in-person visitation altogether. What this did was increase the volume of video visits, which also increased the revenue that they got through the kickbacks. So as we introduce the new technologies, we really have to keep an eye on it and make sure that it really does benefit inmates and their ability to communicate. And it's not just another way to make profit for the correctional facilities.
I think it's really interesting how much people have sort of bought into what the telecom companies or what the companies that are controlling these modes of communication tell us about how this works. Someone pointed out to me the other day that we all call it video visitation when we're talking about it in a prison or jail context, which is in some ways kind of absurd. Like you said it, I say it. Like anywhere else we'd call it as a video call.
Right.
But I just think it's interesting how that language works differently and what that sort of implies.
And it's not a replacement at all.
Right.
Just like this call isn't a replacement for me visiting you.
Right. And, on the topic of visiting or lack thereof, Alex, can you talk some about how COVID has changed the landscape in terms of prisons and communication?
Sure can. So COVID-19 changed everything in prisons and jails for the worse. Lockdown and locked out. What I mean by lockdown, that's pretty self-evident. People got locked down and programming that they would normally day in and day out engage in to help themselves get through their prison sentence or their jail situation can go halt. The lockout was essentially a move to stop all nonprofit organizations from entering into prisons and jails, which historically have provided the bulk of support for people that are going through a difficult time in prison and jail, preparing to re-enter the community. All that stopped, put a tremendous amount of pressure on communication technologies, the JPay terminals that are scattered around some institutions, not all, and telephones, which are much more prevalent and available in all prisons and jails. The pressure to access those increased dramatically. So the entire environment within prisons and jails became so much more stressful than ever before. And I would say undermined safety and security of institutions when people on the inside lose hope, lose connection, and lose a sense of relevance that connection to family and friends on the outside helps them attain and maintain. But most importantly, and I think this is really underappreciated and should be studied to a greater degree, and that's the effect of children on the outside with an incarcerated parent. When children are unable to talk with parents or vice versa, it's extremely difficult and leads to horrible outcomes for, in most cases, the statistics bear out, the child themselves, the children themselves.
Yeah, that's so true. I'm stuck on the thing you said about the loss of hope. And, as a reporter who's been covering prisons for a few years, but, during COVID, I've been covering prisons. I've got to say, I've just gotten some of the most desperate sounding, heartbreaking letters over the past, year or so in particular, because, the letters from prison are always sort of desperate. It's always people wanting you to shed light on their cases and their conditions. But now you layer on top of that they're not seeing their families, and they're also literally just afraid they're going to die because these places are petri dishes, and the virus has circulated so much more behind bars. So I'm that part about the loss of hope is something I think is really important, and I think that family contact is one thing that can mitigate that.
I think it's huge. If I can just add to what I said was, you all are familiar with my company, Choreo, and what we do. And one of the things I do as CEO is I kind of dig into what's actually going on our network, and I do compliance audits, and I listen to messages from time to time. I stay within the terms of service, of course, but what I hear is exactly what you're suggesting, is desperation. Just shout outs to family and friends, I love yous, or just normal stuff like that really makes a difference. But I can't stress enough how important it is for families with an incarcerated parent to ensure that communication between the parent and the child is intact and it is regularized. It shouldn't be an exception. It shouldn't be an oh no. Anyway, I just want to add that to that.
Yeah. Well, I think that sort of all speaks to how deeply rooted some of these problems are. And I was hoping we could talk a little bit about some of the changes that are on the landscape right now. Chris, there was something you said earlier about how, the communications are so one way and asynchronous. And I don't know, I was wondering if you could talk a little more about that. Is that something that you've looked at as a researcher?
No, I haven't necessarily looked at it, that particular part as a researcher. Most of my research is on the post-prison ed side. But some of the things I think about there are kind of one, just thinking about back to the conversation earlier about the role of hope, and also thinking about transformation and the importance of those things, and how the existing prison system doesn't really center on hope and transformation. That isn't what the Department of Corrections really does, right? It sort of holds people in what they would say sort of a safe place, and provides punishment. Oftentimes is sort of, the social role that's often sort of associated with that. It's usually other things that provide like that hope and that transformation, things like higher education inside a prison, things like friends, family members, near peers who have sort of changed their life around, right? We play kind of a central role in that hope and transformation, helping people get to a different place in life and not just stopping being who they were, but being something that can replace that. And, we've seen some movement around both of those two things. In communications, like one of the places where we've seen that is learning management systems. So the education systems have learning management systems. You might know that as like Canvas or Blackboard or something like that. And, we see learning management systems starting to be adopted by some forward progressive prison systems like Washington and California. But those systems are largely asynchronous. And so they provide an opportunity for educators on the outside to connect with students on the inside by uploading certain information that the students can then download, and students can then upload responses back. But it doesn't provide an opportunity for synchronous communication with faculty members. And I'm sure all of you out there right now know how important that synchronous communication is to really developing relationships with friends and colleagues. If you think about before COVID, the monthly meetings, those were kind of like, no one wanted the monthly meetings, right? But now some of us cherish those monthly meetings because sometimes it's the only time we get to see one of our friends and colleagues. And the asynchronous communication doesn't allow us to like form those firm bonds. And that's important as educators, but it's even more important for the friends and family members out there who are trying to provide that hope, provide that inspiration for transformation and growth. And we have seen some movement on that. For example, there are, we have some video meetings that were mentioned earlier, video visits, if you will. But also, like, sometimes people are able to present at conferences, but that's very limited, and it's something that where we see a challenge in the prison system in maintaining those communication systems, because oftentimes a correctional officer will need to be present in order for that person to present at a conference, and it requires the permission and availability of those correctional officers. But we do see some movement in asynchronous learning management systems and the need to develop those more synchronously. And we see a little bit of experimental work in using video for sort of live group presentations, if you will.
Yeah, well, thank you for all of those thoughts. You covered a lot there. So Alex, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what sort of changes we're seeing with technology in prisons and jails right now.
Wi-Fi, it's there, and it's locked down, but it's used, and its availability should be recognized and adopted in a way that helps people that are incarcerated do the things that make the difference when they're released. For example, education is key to lowering recidivism. I mean, this panel is prison comms and the effect on recidivism. Communication is at the heart of all of this, and lowering recidivism is the key outcome that makes all the things that require an investment palatable to taxpayers. It's when you have an outcome that is favorable. Today, the outcome is 2/3 of people that leave prison go back into prison within 3 years, and that's a failure by any measure. So I would encourage correctional officials to look at the enabling technology that's all around them and ask the question, what are we really trying to accomplish here? We don't want a panopticon for sure, but we also don't want people locked down and becoming less able to help themselves, because inside prison it really is up to you. Of course, those who have support networks on the outside They have better outcomes than those that don't. But the technology is here. The ability to control it and apply it in a way that is useful and helps corrections do what the public actually expects corrections to do, and that is rehabilitate.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting you brought up the Wi-Fi, because I keep hearing this as one of the challenges at some prisons where, you know, you can't get decent Wi-Fi inside some of these prisons, depending on where their structure, you know, where they are and what the structure is. And I think that's such a big challenge that, you know, that we're going to have to overcome at some point.
Carrie, I would say that's generally a choice. That's much less a factor, but yeah, I've heard that as well. But I have not been to a lot of prisons and jails. Although you rightly pointed out, I have had an experience there personally from the biggest mistake I've made in my life. It just so happens that the institutions I ended up at, Wi-Fi was available, although there are other deficiencies, and it wasn't utilized the way it could have been for better outcomes, like education, for example, to Chris's larger point.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of the choice, I think, is also the choice of where to put the prisons, which ends up creating these problems. So Carrie, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, sort of give us some context at a national level. Has there been any sort of progress on a regulatory or legislative level?
There has. The Campaign for Prison Phone Justice achieved rate regulation through the Federal Communications Commission in October of 2015, when they capped the rates for an interstate prison telecom call at 21 cents a minute. And an interstate call is a call from one state to another state. This hasn't affected at all, I will note, the profitability of the prison telecoms. The two largest prison telecoms, which are Securus and GTL, reported revenues combined of $650 million last year. So they're doing just fine, even with a reduction in rates. In August of 2020, the FCC initiated another rulemaking process to further reduce the cost of interstate calls to 14 cents a minute. And while this is excellent news for calls from correctional facilities from one state to another, approximately 80% of all inmate calls are in-state calls, and those calls are not and cannot be regulated federally. So while a good number of state prisons recognize the importance of family communications, and they've worked to continue to reduce rates. It kind of started with the FCC in 2015, and then it's carried on, and state prisons have continued to reduce rates. The jails are still a problem. Inmate calls from jails in this country can exceed $1 a minute. In the state of Arkansas, for example, the average cost of a 15-minute call from Arkansas jails is $14.49 for 15 minutes. And it's important to remember that the vast majority of people in jails have not been convicted. So their ability to stay in touch with their legal counsel, their employers, as well as their families is really important. Advocacy groups continue to work at the state and local levels to reduce the cost of calls, and this needs to continue. And it really can be done. In July of 2020, the San Francisco jail became the first jail in the country to offer inmate calls at no cost. And this is a model that needs to be implemented in all jails across the country.
That's fabulous. So I want to look at sort of like moving forward, like when we're looking at the impact that these technologies can have in the long run when it comes to, you know, recidivism and reentry. I'd like to talk some about what the impact might be of improving communications options behind bars. So Dr. Beasley, from your research on the transition from prison to college, what have you seen? Like, how important is maintaining these sorts of ties when it comes to successful reentry?
Yeah, from what little research is out there on the transition from prison to college, some of the things that come up most often are are things like feelings of stigma, feelings of isolation, and the importance of social support systems, particularly peers and near peers. And we don't exactly know why those social support systems are so helpful or why peers and near peers seem to have such an impact, but we can kind of postulate why. For example, some of the literature on the transformation of oneself and in general, that broad literature outside of reentry, that broad literature suggests that that we become inspired by others who are like us, who have changed in certain ways or sort of achieved certain selves. And we might see part of ourself in them and see another part of something we could become in them as well, right? So we can sort of postulate that that might be important in reentry and sort of having near peers that have transformed. But, you know, but without those kind of contexts while you're incarcerated, without some kind of clear communication systems for maintaining those relationships, we can't benefit from those peers. We can't benefit from those near peers and the inspiration that they provide. But I imagine as the communication systems become more open, I could imagine you know, formerly incarcerated people who have transformed their lives through higher education, being a source of inspiration, being a source of support. Same thing for family members like mine that were able to provide support after I got out, being able to provide that support while people are inside. And I imagine a world in which more than 4% of formerly incarcerated people get a bachelor's degree because they're able to work on that, to get that inspiration and get that support while they're still inside. So I imagine these more flexible communication systems will provide greater opportunity for these informal support systems to help inspire people and provide them support while they're inside, so that they're ready to hit the ground running and transform their lives once they get out.
You know, that 4% number is such a stark statistic. So shifting gears here. So Carrie, you know, legislatively, what is a possible path forward here from a sort of legislative or policy perspective? Like, what could people watching this advocate for?
What they could advocate for is the elimination of monopoly contracts for prison phone calls in their local correctional facilities. These are the key problem to the rates are these contracts and the kickbacks that the correctional facilities receive. That's what drives the rates up. If there was some competition, both for inmate calls as well as other products and services that are offered in correctional facilities, this would go a long way to reducing the costs for families, and it would allow families to maintain and perhaps even strengthen relationships during times of incarceration. And I will point out, on a practical level, inmate families should not be subsidizing correctional facilities in this country. They are, and it should not happen. Nationally, work needs to continue with the FCC to further reduce the cost of inmate calls. I think rates should be in the single digits. On the state and local level, work needs to continue with the Public Utilities Commission as well as city and county councils to eliminate the kickbacks and the monopoly contracts again, which will reduce the cost of the calls. And finally, we need to increase the rate that we are replacing the archaic technologies in our current correctional facilities with new innovations, with a focus on keeping access to family and support networks easy and affordable. Study after study shows that inmates who are able to maintain relationships while they're incarcerated have more success at reentry than those who can't maintain those relationships due to cost.
Thanks. That's all like that's all very important perspective. Thank you for that. Alex, so I don't know if you want to finish us up here with what do you hope to see in the future when you consider the innovations that are coming into play today in the realm of prison communications?
So I would like to see prison communications become decentralized and more ubiquitous within prison programs, and just in general, an emphasis on connections, communication, asynchronous or synchronous, both have a role in prison-based communications, but I think it shouldn't be the exception. Access should be the norm. It's your support networks that hold you accountable and responsible for what you do inside prison, as well as whether or not you're going to succeed post-release. And I know personally, because I was very lucky to have a support network, and while I saw the opportunity in communications, and Choreo came out of those personal experiences. Without it, and yes, I had access to development resources, so we were able to put a development. We were able to put a beta together and actually test it. And the effect for me, being able to exchange messages and enhanced communication, had a huge difference on my success. And I've seen it in others, as I have stayed in touch with, and people have stayed in touch with me post release. Communications is key to a successful reentry.
Well, on a personal level, but I want to thank everyone for watching this panel and everyone for participating. I think we've covered a lot of ground here, from sort of understanding the basic scope of the problem and the current communication situation to touching on some of the technological changes and the value of maintaining communications and some of the policy changes and what's going on in the legislative realm. If anyone watching this, if you have other questions for us, I think we're all pretty findable on social media. But before we sign off, I just want to say how wonderful it is to have a panel with so many formerly incarcerated people. It's kind of remarkable to see. And I think it really shows how much our attitudes as a country are changing when it comes to prisons and former prisoners, because I can't really imagine this panel happening 10 or 20 years ago. And with that, I want to thank you all for tuning in and have a great day.
Thank you.